Hello, my name's Steve B and I'm a presenter on IndyLive Radio. I present Music and Musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on IndyLive Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Clackmann and Show Women for Independence. Did you know we have a podcast on IndyLive Radio? Goes out at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, repeated at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Come and join us for some news, views, opinions, the odd poem. It'd be very nice to have you with us. And come and hear the news you're not getting. Here's some new voices for a new Scotland at IndyLive Radio.
Film, you can watch this again, you can be part of it. It's Independence Live. Yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
No Westminster. No Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But before I'll be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom, one more. Oh, freedom over me.
Hi there, I'm Cliff.
And I'm Russ.
And we're from the Veterans for Scottish Independence 2.0 group. And we're just invading your privacy today to let you know that we will be very shortly pushing a programme out on live stream to do with the veterans, their needs as it will be during an independent campaign, the next independence campaign, and indeed in an independent Scotland.
So get yourself in gear, come and join us, pull up a sandbag.
Yes.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Welcome, friends, to an online talk hosted by All Under One Banner. My name is Andrew. I help to organise All Under One Banner, and I'll be your chair for this evening. Now that everyone is here, one or two are still joining, but now that all of us are here, points, we continue to miss the massive Indy family, and we look forward to being with you, every single one of you, as soon as it's possible. You're all in our minds. Please continue to take the very best care of yourselves and of your clans, especially as the lockdown begins to evolve and the rules change day by day. If there are any technical difficulties this evening, please bear with us and we will persevere. This event is being live streamed on Facebook and YouTube and other channels. So if you would like to watch this evening's discussion back, then you will be able to do so there. And also a recording of this will go on to the All Under One Banner YouTube channel. Everyone apart from the panel guests this evening and me are muted on this video conference. We will, of course, take questions from everyone present. If you would like to ask a question, please either raise your hand, which you will find if you press the participants button at the bottom of your screen, or use the chat function. Using chat, please type your name and the question which you would like to ask or the comment that you'd like to make. We do it that way in order that we can manage the questions and the comments, and also it means that everyone can hear what's going on.
I'd like to make a couple of introductory comments before we get started. All Under One banner is all about organising marches on the streets of towns and cities across Scotland in support of Scottish independence. A few weeks ago, we announced plans for a gradual return to those streets, but with a few major differences. We are not organising any marches at the moment, but of course, when it is the proper time to do so, then you can be sure that we will immediately. Please bear in mind also that in the near future, there will be a Stirling Live online ceòl on Broadcasting Scotland on Saturday, the 12th of September. We also have plans for more discussions and talks online, and I'll say more about those at the end of this evening. When we were beginning to plan this series of talks and discussions, we very quickly realised that panel discussions were particularly successful. We started working on a panel to discuss alternative routes to independence, and I am delighted to say that 3 great campaigners have each agreed to join us here this evening. I'll introduce them now to you one at a time. Firstly, Suzanne Blackley is from Dumfries and is a campaigner for Scottish independence online and on her twice-weekly internet radio show on Webcom Radio. When she's not doing that, she has a family of 3 to keep her busy, and if that wasn't enough, she's about to start studying for her PGDE in primary education. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi there.
Suzanne, I think that you had a name check that you were going to make.
Yes, happy birthday to Neil. He's 37 today.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm glad that we've got that out of the way, so Neil's happy. And as you say, he's not a day over 21, you know. Secondly, we have David Carvala, who is originally from Finland. However, David has lived and campaigned in Barcelona for more than 20 years. He is the coordinator of Omnium Cultural's Shared Struggles project and has been campaigning against the far right, for example, in Spain against Vox. He has campaigned in countries as widespread as Uruguay and Egypt, and he writes just as widely, most recently with his book about the Russian Revolution. Good evening, David.
Good evening, and thanks for inviting me.
It's great to see you. Thirdly, we have Chris McEleny. Chris is an SNP councillor on Inverclyde Council. He led that council for many years. However, he has recently stepped down and is seeking the party's nomination to stand for Greenock and Inverclyde in the 2021 Scottish elections. Chris is a very keen supporter of Morton FC, and he says that his worst subject at school was Spanish. Mio Dio, Chris.
See.
It's great to see all of you here, and thank you for joining us this evening. We should crack on with the conversation and see where we go. And Chris, I was going to start off with you this evening, if that's okay. Chris, you worked with Angus MacNeil MP to promote what has been called a Plan B approach. It would bypass a second referendum in the event that there was a majority in support of independence at Holyrood after the 2021 Scottish elections. To start this evening's discussion off, can you maybe say a little about what the thinking is behind that Plan B approach?
Yeah, sure. I did think it was interesting that it's Neil Mackay's birthday. It means he shares a birthday with Usain Bolt. It takes him under 10 seconds to run 100 metres, and it takes Neil Mackay about 3 hours to walk from Holyrood Palace to the Meadows.
That's only because Neil's got 100,000 friends with him at the time.
Oh, very true. But yeah, Plan B, I suppose this is my fault, Angus's fault. There's a misunderstanding that Plan B means that you don't support Plan A. If that's the case, we would be calling on a new Plan A. So we're fully supportive of the best way to test the public opinion on whether the people of Scotland believe there should be, whether they believe that Scotland should be an independent country or not, is through a referendum. And ideally, because when Scotland becomes an independent country, England's going to be a substantial country that we share a border with. So you want to have a good ongoing relationship with that country. So ideally, the 2012 Edinburgh Agreement set out the best practice for how you have a consensual referendum process, but it's a consensual referendum process. But for there to be that same process, you need the UK government to agree to it. So if they don't agree to a Section 30 order and to have a referendum in line with what we had in 2014 thanks to the Edinburgh Agreement, then you quite simply cannot have that referendum process. So Plan B, I think, is the ultimate political tool to actually build the foundations to force Boris Johnson into a position that he agrees to a Section 30 order to have a referendum. But if he doesn't agree to that, that we actually start to build up a democratic legitimacy behind the very notion that the people of Scotland never lost their sovereignty. They may have gave their independence away in 1707, but we never lost our sovereignty. So if a democratic event such as an election expresses clearly the will of the Scottish people, then I think that is legitimate. And I think it actually then gets us into a campaign strategy, and also sets out a tactic for, one, how we can continue to build on the momentum for the why Scotland should be an independent country, which is many well-rehearsed arguments, particularly since 2014, when the opposing arguments, whether it's on currency, whether it's on the EU, etc., are all crumbling on a regular basis. But I think what we need to be doing clearly getting into the 2021 election, because it's very easy to get a front page headline that says an SNP majority in 2021 means we will commit to holding a referendum in the life of the next Parliament. But that's what we committed to in 2016. I mean, it was pretty clear, it's been well rehearsed, you know, in the event of that material change, something like Scotland being dragged out of the EU against our will, which has now happened, the people of Scotland would have a right to have a referendum on their own future. Theresa May simply didn't respond to the request in 2017. Boris Johnson and his surrogates that he sends north of the border, one after the other, talked down the notion of a referendum, and Boris Johnson finally said no himself. And just to pursue on this point for a moment, I think it's brilliant when I see polls that say that independence is now the continued majority view of the people of Scotland. I think that's absolutely great. And I think that from an SNP politician's point of view, with the SNP clearly being the major political party of the independence movement, that's great if that translates into votes for the SNP to get us elected again in 2021. But the SNP, Plan A, whatever you want to call it, isn't to win elections for the SNP, it's to deliver independence for Scotland. That's the very reason the Scottish National Party came into being. So I think that if we have another election, we're going to have another election in 2021, and if we're saying that clearly a vote for the SNP means we will have a referendum, and if opinion polls are currently sitting somewhere between 52 to 54%, with the Brexit, the European Union sort of leeway period coming to an end at the end of this year, the potential of a hard Brexit, if we went to that election, the SNP won an overwhelming landslide in that election, and Boris Johnson sitting in some dark room in 10 Downing Street with Dominic Cummings, and he's saying to him, well, Dominic, the pesky Scots, you know, they've got a point here. They voted a majority SNP government, a majority of the seats, a majority of the votes. Support for independence is sitting at 60%, 65%. I think we need to give them this Section 30 order. Well, does Boris Johnson and the UK government want to keep the Scottish oil, the Scottish assets, Scotland in the UK? Well, I think the answer is yes to that, because that's why they've tried so hard to stop us getting independence. Why then would they sanction an independence referendum? If we're thinking from their position for a moment, why would they possibly, in this whole argument about democracy, we know that people like Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson don't care about people's democratic views. I mean, you just need to look at him driving up to Bernard Castle and the fact that we're willing to throw the entire view of the Tory party in England under a bus to save Dominic Cummings. So let's not pretend for a minute that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are going to care about an absolute minority of the vote, which to them is Scotland. But I just think it's a really unrealistic prospect to expect that the more likely it is for Scotland to vote for independence, the more likely it will be that Boris Johnson will facilitate that by agreeing to a referendum on Scottish independence. So I think that leading up to the 2021 election, we've got to be clear that a vote for the SNP, a majority of pro-independence MSPs elected to the Scottish Parliament means there will be a referendum on Scottish independence. And I would go as far as, in advance of that election, naming broadly a date of September 2021 of when we'll be holding that referendum. And that means that in that election, you'll be going to affirm that you are saying with your vote, you support a referendum on Scottish independence in September of 2021. And I think then that's a clear democratic, legitimate choice for the Scottish people. So after that election, of course, if Boris Johnson wants to say, well, no, I'm not agreeing to a Section 30 order, then we've clearly got an electoral mandate that just says we're having a referendum. So where I slightly disagree with, and I must say I think it's a phenomenal effort for Martin Keating, the amount of money he's raised, it absolutely shows you the support and strength of the independence movement. Phenomenal effort. But where I disagree is that, for me, I don't feel that it should be the role of the Scottish Parliament to assert in a court of law that we are sovereign. I believe we are sovereign. If Boris Johnson and the UK government wishes to come and say that the people of Scotland, through their sovereign democratic elected parliament, don't have the right to ask the people of Scotland about one of the most fundamental issues of our time, then I think it's up to them to come and chase us through a court. So whether that they chose to do that or not, then that's what they should do. But if ultimately Boris Johnson refuses a Section 30 order, if he then manages some legal trickery to block the people of Scotland having a democratic choice on their own future, that's why I think we need that firm plan B there in this election manifesto that clearly makes it known to people in Scotland when they go to vote for SNP, and also makes it known in the decision halls of Whitehall and Westminster that the people of Scotland say they want a referendum because they support the SNP or any other pro-independence party. I'll not try and monopolise that. They support independence, they support Scotland's right to choose their own future. But if Boris Johnson and the UK government deny us the very right to have a choice on our future, then we need a democratic mechanism to actually ensure Scotland's right to choose its future is enacted. And I think that pro-independence majority of MSP says that we're giving you the triple lock, Boris. One, we'll play it your way, the Section 30 in line with the Edinburgh Agreement. If you don't want to do that, well, the people of Scotland have agreed that we should have a referendum anyway. And if you manage to stimulate that through court, and I wouldn't bet on his chances based on his last exercise when he came up against Joanna Cherry, but if he somehow manages to block us having a choice on our own future, the people of Scotland have already taken that very realistic possibility into mind when they voted in that election, and they've actually then said to the Scottish government, because we live in a representative democracy, remember, we kind of forget that with the borak that Brexit cost. And if our democratic elected MSPs elected by a pro-independence majority of seats and a pro-independence majority of votes, if they then vote in our parliament after Boris Johnson refusing us a Section 30 order, after Boris Johnson blocking us to have a right to have a choice in our own future, I think it's absolutely democratic, it's absolutely legitimate for our MSPs to then vote to enter into independence negotiations with the UK government. And at that point, I think we have moved the whole debate on a much greater distance than it is at the moment, and quite simply, to stop the people of Scotland having a choice on their own future, we've conceded that at the moment, all Boris Johnson has got to do is say no. I don't think that's acceptable, and that's why I think we need a plan B for independence.
Thanks, Chris. You made some fantastic points, and I think amongst other things, the multifaceted aspect of the campaign more broadly, using all legal and legitimate techniques and routes that would be available to us, including testing the question, as you say, the question that shouldn't really have to be tested, but anyway, testing the question of who is sovereign in Scotland. And of course, I suppose there's an English perspective there with the sovereignty of Westminster and English law and politics having been asserted relatively strongly recently. The contrast with the Scottish constitutional position, I think, probably is one of the reasons behind it. But that was a great opening. Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have come up already, and if I may, I'll just deal with them quickly just now. Firstly, Jackie, who's in the room, is just asking, talking about the 2021 election and still building support. Chris, do you think it's now impossible to have a referendum this year? And there's a second question I'll put to you as well at the same time, if I can just find it quickly. It was a question with regard to why the SNP have pulled out of the Martin's court case. I'll not ask you to answer that. I'll give an observation about it. There's no point. I'm not going to put you on a position of giving legal advice in respect to the party. That's not the point. But to go back to Jackie's question, and I think it's a straightforward one, but in terms of this 2021 election, still building support, do you think it's now impossible to have a referendum this year?
Short answer is no. Nothing should ever really be considered as impossible in politics. Politics is often forgotten that it is the art of the possible. But I think pragmatically and logistically speaking, I come from Inverclyde, still seeing every day some cases of the virus. We're still seeing an issue I was dealing with tonight, a traffic jam at a testing centre because people from other parts of the Glasgow region are coming here to get tested. That is, for many people, the priority right now, quite rightly so. So realistically, if we're talking about a referendum, we are having some serious teething problems and getting schools back to full-time education, businesses back to full-time. I think it would be very difficult under those circumstances to be then saying to people that we should go straight into an independence referendum sometime, well, next month, September. So that's really out the window. October's out the window. November's out the window. Possibly you could do it in December if you manage to railroad through the legislation. I don't think it's pragmatic, and I think we should never lose sight that as much as when I'm going on about Plan B, a lot of people think it's the how. We've fundamentally got to make the case for why Scotland should be independent, because 50% plus one vote's enough to win the election. But I want to the referendum. I want to win the case for Scottish independence on 60, 65, 70% of the vote, and I think that on the back of the sheer mess that Boris Johnson and the UK government are currently getting themselves involved in, and I think as it crystallises into people actually making a decision on actually when the Scottish government have the levers at their disposal, whether it's on furlough, which is ending in October, I think all of these things lead into a position that I think that people who maybe have had some family members have been unwell or have been died, I think it's going to take some time to recover from that. And as we go into next spring, into the summer, into a period of renewal, I think that's the ideal time to actually be, because you can't go knock a door in, as we know, in this climate. And I think that the Scottish independence is a fundamentally important issue. But as great as these Zoom conversations are, you'll know there's a large section of citizens still don't have the capacity to navigate stuff like Zoom, etc., social media, you name it. So I think that, yes, technically it would be possible, but I think that pragmatically and logistically it wouldn't be the right thing to do. And I think that's why we now need to affirm not seek another mandate in 2021, because we've got several mandates that, we need to start taking tally marks of how many mandates that the people of Scotland have given the SNP and the Scottish Government. And I think in 2021 we should be affirming that, yes, there should be a referendum of Scottish independence, and at some point at the end of the summer, start of autumn next year, that's when that referendum should be held.
Great, thank you. David, I'll come to you in a moment, but first of all, to give perhaps two different ends of two different aspects of the arguments from a Scottish perspective just now, and then we'll broaden it out, having covered the Scottish component. I was going to ask Suzanne. Suzanne, you campaign mainly online, and online campaigning for many, as Chris's points out, not for everybody, but for many people, online activities have become even more important during lockdown. Have you seen, what's your view? What have you seen people who are working with you and campaigning with you online saying about the alternative routes, and in particular, for example, the Plan B that Chris has been talking about?
There's been support for Chris and Angus's Plan B, absolutely. There's a lot of frustration with the people that I speak to every day on Twitter, on Facebook. As Chris said, how many mandates do we need to give the SNP before they do something? That's ultimately the question. And then also the fact that, they wonder why we're asking for a Section 30 in the first place. That's a big question that comes up, because, how many Prime Ministers are going to refuse to give Nicola Sturgeon a Section 30? Honestly, in my own opinion, I don't ever see, if we just arranged a referendum, I honestly do not think that Westminster would take us to court, because then you've got to bring in the whole subject of the UN, and they're basically denying our right to self-determination, and obviously the stance that Westminster took on Kosovo. Then you've got all that coming in. I honestly just feel that it's like we're setting a bar But I keep asking for a Section 30. It's like we're saying to Westminster, right, we have got to ask you for this. Whereas, you know, I think that we could probably go it by ourselves. I honestly don't think that we have to ask for a Section 30. And, that, you know, that's why I've been supporting Martin Keating's case, because that just rules that out completely. And there's a lot of support for it on Twitter. A lot of people are right behind them 100% on this. And they're frustrated at people who are current SNP MPs. I won't name any names, but a certain one who seems to be blocking everybody and who has basically just ripped this whole Martin Keating's case to shreds.
Okay, there was one other thing in there that you were talking about, Nick. It really followed on a little bit a point that you made, and it follows on a little bit from Chris. From when you're engaging with in your online activism and engaging with people online, do you get any sense that people are either want to know or understand the legal aspects, the constitutional aspects, they have a view on the political aspects? Do you feel that there's enough in the way of education and understanding to move the conversation forward, or do you think we would benefit from a period of an appropriate period of concerted education and concerted discussion around about the nuts and bolts of the current constitutional position, subject, of course, to ongoing court actions as well?
I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of people on Twitter that know a lot. Probably more than some of the SNP officials, but yeah, I think I think that people would benefit from, you know, some education on it. Definitely. I mean, there's a few camps within the independence movement. There's ones who are just following Nicola Sturgeon because she's done such a good job during COVID. There's a lot like that. There's a lot who would just declare UDI tomorrow. And then there's another group who are just looking for different ideas as to what way we go next. And there's a lot of discussion on that. Yes,
that's absolutely right. Thank you. That's great. Now, having spoken about two perspectives, or two complementary perspectives on the debate from a purely Scottish perspective, I'd like to turn now to David, who has experience of campaigning in a number of countries, but in particular in Spain. And of course, the legal aspects and the application of Spanish criminal codes to those who were campaigning for Catalan independence is well reported, including Catalan politicians who ended up in Scotland. So it would be interesting, David, to get from you a perspective of both of the conversation we've had so far, which is broadly working within the Constitution in the United Kingdom, unwritten though it is, but also other routes and other aspects that occur to you in listening to this conversation.
Yeah, well, as I said before, thanks for inviting me. It's a strange situation, really, because I was in Scotland just before the referendum and talked to people there, but I haven't been able to follow it in any detail. Every national question is different in some ways, but there are also some things in common. I mean, one comparison doesn't help you very much, but I mean, sad to say, because I grew up in Britain, but I'm sorry to say the British government is actually better on this than the Spanish government. If you look at the Irish peace process, there was an Irish peace process. Here, ETA tries to dissolve and tries to have a peace process, and the government said, no, carry on putting bombs. We don't want a peace process. And the ETA prisoners are still in prison, sometimes, you know, dying in prison. Yes. And in Scotland, at least the first referendum, they let you have it. And here, you know, the last time we tried to vote, we had 10,000 pleas smashing 1,000 heads. So in that sense, it's possible to talk about reasonable discussions and agreements in Britain that here are impossible. But I think some of the same arguments I heard here, I hear echoes of them in Scotland. Like a typical argument here was that if we have the referendum, like the last referendum, the 1st of October 2017, it was a unilateral referendum because the Spanish government didn't allow it. And people saying, if we get a big result, then they'll just have to pay attention. They'll just have to listen to us because that's democracy. And of course, it didn't happen. then people are saying, well, at least the European Union will have to intervene because it's human rights. You know, how can they possibly allow police repression against a citizens' movement in a European country? Well, I'm sorry, but I mean, European countries have been sending in riot police to attack citizens' protests for as long as it exists, and specifically national movements. And in other contexts, I mean, we've had 30,000 people die in the Mediterranean, and there's no sign the European Union is worried about that. We had European Union committing austericide against the Greek people, and they didn't worry about that. So there's no reason to believe that European leaders were going to lose any sleep about the democratic rights of the Catalan people, and they didn't. And so the parties that put a lot of faith in that then didn't know what to do. So I think, I don't know who, somebody probably said that in politics, in the end of the day, it comes down to power. Probably somebody horrible said it. But sadly, it is about that. Abstract democratic principles in themselves don't win, generally. The question is power. And so here then the question of what power? And even having the demonstrations, I mean, we've had the biggest demonstrations I've been on in my life, and I was on the anti-war demonstration in 2003, about 1.5 million people in Barcelona, is the biggest ever. The pro-independence demonstration has been even bigger than that, but, you know, they pay no attention. And so here, and picking up from what Chris said, that I think it's not enough to have 51% in the vote. Formally, it should be correct. I mean, in a democratic world, you say, you know, we have the referendum, we vote, and the majority wins. But we don't live in that democratic situation. So we need to find ways of expressing more force. I think that one of the best things for me that happened in October 2017, around the time of the referendum, was first the fact that we had the referendum was only thanks to popular mobilization. I think the Catalan government called the referendum thinking it would be banned, and then they'd be able to complain to Europe saying, look, they wouldn't accept that referendum. And it was popular mobilization, people occupying the voting stations all through the weekend to enable the voting to go ahead, resisting police attacks. That was the first one. And then on the 3rd of October, we had a massive general strike across Catalonia. And when you have a general strike, and it was a real general strike, it wasn't just a symbolic thing. It was, you know, people walking out of the workplaces and mass protests. One image, and I'll close with this. The working class area just north of Barcelona, which is heavily Spanish speaking, it's not independentist heartlands. Here, Catalonia is different from Scotland. I know in Scotland, it was a working class areas that most voted for independence. In Catalonia, it's not at all. But it was the working class areas of the north of Barcelona on the day, the 3rd of October, the day of the general strike. There's a brilliant photo. There's massive, massive avenue just full of people marching down into the center. From that, mainly Spanish-speaking working class area. And I think it's that the sort of force that can change the balance. It won't be a new referendum that would just be like another sort of a groundhog day of what we had before, and people have had enough of that. I think if we can put force on the ground, which isn't just citizens protesting, if it's workers stopping work, then that actually hits where it hurts. Because it's actually the big ruling class in Catalonia is against independence. You know, they're not part of our gang, they're the enemy. And so if you could link independence much more strongly to the social question and to working class issues, then I think that's the direction I have to go to win. I interviewed Jordi Cuixart a few weeks ago, and one of the things he said, which is very impressive, he said, if independence was just about changing a flag, I wouldn't be in prison for it. We want the Catalan Republic because of our commitment to democratic and social justice. We can't conceive the national struggle without the social struggle because they're two sides of the same coin. So I think we need to look at that side of it. Independence, not just to pull down one flag and pull up another one. There's a good quote by James Connolly about this, but to say we want a different sort of society. And I think along that route is where we pick up a lot more people than the ones that, you know, the 50% or so we have in Catalonia that want, you know, prefer Catalonia to Spain. There's a lot more people that would opt for a real social change linked to a constituent process around independence. I think we need to go down that line. For me, that's the sort of direction. It's not a simple answer in terms of having a referendum, having a vote in parliament, but I think the experience here is, unless we go down that way, we don't have any other route because they don't pay attention to democratic votes. So we need something else.
Thanks, David. That's a number of really important points in there, and I can immediately see read across from some of the points that you're making to the current social circumstances that we're in Scotland at the moment, and other countries are too. the point I'm making is that, of course, we have so much government time understandably being committed to the management of the COVID crisis. And certainly from my conversations that I've had with international press, they seem convinced that the polling in Scotland that is improving in favour of independence is as a result of the performance of the Scottish government in contrast to the Westminster government. Now, I've disagreed with every journalist that said that to me. I feel personally it's much more to do with Brexit, but that's just my opinion. But my point is that if the current performance of the Scottish government can be portrayed as having increased focus on social justice, literally the welfare of the citizens, and being more concerned about the welfare of the citizens than a Westminster government might be, and I don't think that's a very hard argument to win, it might be the case that, for example, the point that you're making about putting social issues and social justice at the core of the argument for independence, I think it is part of the argument anyway, but in the current circumstances where people's lives have been at risk, and you know, there's been a threat that wasn't around in 2014, to be specific, that maybe perhaps the social justice aspects to that are important, but also, and I'll stop talking because I'm not meant to be talking tonight. The point that you made about mobilization and organization of everybody is obviously extremely important, and is something that's very close to our hearts, and all under one banner. Mobilizing demonstrations across the whole country is what we are here to do, and it's what's most important for us. So it's interesting to hear you talking about that being an important component part of the mixture of the toolkit that we use, of the variety of tools that we use to apply pressure and to secure the independence. Chris, picking up, you're in Inverclyde, as you said, one of the hotspots of COVID. We're not here to talk about COVID, but David's point about social justice, I think, is very important. What do you see that there's mileage in terms of tying the independence campaign to social justice for all citizens in Scotland?
Yeah, it's obviously, it's quite multifaceted. Personally speaking, it's a bit of a difficult one for me, because I obviously, if you remember, won a legal ruling that had a philosophical belief in Scottish independence, because I just believe that Scotland is a sovereign nation and it should be free to make its own decisions. And as much as my own personal political worldview is that I would probably relate to somebody like James Connolly that says that independence for independence sake, just to mimic and repeat the very institutions from the country you're seeking to gain independence from, is academic. But it's always going to be a case of a democratically elected government of an independent Scotland did want to pursue similar policies in particular areas, and that's the whole point of independence, is the choice, whereas at the moment we don't have a choice. So people like myself often say that when Scotland becomes independent, we can rid Scotland of Trident. Now, I think that fundamentally you would see overwhelming support from whatever government of any colour was elected to an independent Scottish Parliament. That, of course, is a choice for that government to make. At the moment, we don't have the choice. And again, back to the issue, which I think is related to social justice, is furlough. So communities like this and other parts of Scotland, I don't think it matters the nature of deprivation, to be honest with you. If you're on furlough at the moment and that scheme ends, I think there's going to be real hardship. There's an artificial employment figure at the moment, because people are being kept in work just because of furlough, and as soon as that ends, I think many people that are in work are actually going to find that they're very quickly unemployed. But Germany, of course, have made a decision to extend that by, it's going to last 2 years, or scheme. In April, the Republic of Ireland's government, they raised €6 billion by issuing bonds to immediately invest money in various social economic policies to support people through recovery. Well, not quite recovery, actually, it was a sharp end at that point, but that was something like €18 billion oversubscribed, that scheme, whereas in Scotland, we've only got the ability to borrow £450 million a year, which, I mean, I'm saying only because, you know, that's numbers we'll never, it's just big numbers as soon as you get 100 million, because it's kind of beyond your grasp of how many cars and houses that could possibly buy you. But the point is, at the moment, you contrast this to independent Ireland. They managed in one bond issue to raise €6 billion, almost double what Scotland's actually allowed to borrow forever. at any one point in time. So I just think it shows you why, if you want to have an agenda for social justice, something that's very important to me, I think that's why it's important to actually not just, of course you've got to deliver the day job, because we've heard that one, get on with the day job, but I think we need to go beyond that sometimes and not be scared. I think particularly with the coronavirus, there's been an apprehension to get political, but it's a political choice to end the furlough scheme. It's a political choice whether taxes will be increased or policies such as the rate clause, a policy that was absolutely driven through austerity to save costs. All of these fundamental economic decisions are going to be made in the next 2 months. You know what I mean? How do we deal with 10%, the OBR's projection of 10% unemployment? How do we deal with the deficit and the debt, which are two separate things, of course, both important, what they currently sit on? And you should watch the network news, because it's quite important how they present this. Talk about approaching £2 trillion of debt, but they just gloss over the fact that about 600 billion, and that's actually the Bank of England's debt, and the UK government is effectively the owner of the Bank of England. So it's just an example of how sometimes they present austerity as being essential and inevitable because of economic circumstances we're in. The chap tonight was speaking about, oh, we've not seen this level of debt since the war. Now, we're sitting at just over 100% of GDP, whereas at the end of the Second War, we were 150% GDP. And in those very tough, much tougher economic circumstances, Britain, which is the Britain I think a lot of people are actually starting to realise doesn't exist anymore, that Britain created the NHS on the back of course, a war, but of course, the economic turbulence that war caused. And you had a whole generation of people that actually in 2014, when I was knocking doors, they actually were quite agnostic to the notion of Scottish independence. But when they were thinking about Britain, they were thinking about the Britain of their childhood, you know, the post-war ethos, the NHS, things that, quite frankly, Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings are actually probably sitting right now figuring out a way how to sell it off to the highest bidder. You know, I mean, chlorinated chicken sounds good, you know, it's a bit of it's a good way to capture a policy, but the reality is these are just distractions. It's the NHS is the real meal that's on the table. And I think that as more people realise actually that, quite ironically, in fact, of the sort of social justice agenda that get promoted after the Second World War was the reason you voted no in 2014, to protect that now, it might actually be that you need to vote for Scotland to become an independent country so that we can make sure we control our NHS, because of course, another tactic that's often used is, well, the NHS has devolved, so any decisions at the NHS is purely up to the Scottish Government. But the reality is, of the UK Government continue their clear privatisation agenda, and they continue to then reduce spending on devolved matters, that sees a reduction in environment consequentials. And it forces us into having to then cut services or privatise services. And it's actually then when you maybe start to realise the fundamental importance of the wider economic levers, that when you don't have them in control, you're effectively just administrating a fixed budget across a fixed set of services, because all these big decisions actually determine how much your budget can be and what you can do. I mean, Kate Forbes, for example, if she copied what Ireland had done, which, you know, borrowing's at record low levels, it's at negative interest effectively. You can borrow for free, as stupid as that sounds. And that's what countries like Ireland are doing. You know, that's like countries like New Zealand are doing. They're spending more per GDP than the United Kingdom. The Chancellor copied these furlough scheme from Norway. You know, it's all these small independent countries have managed to make these very important economic decisions. One, because it's easier to borrow than it's ever been before. Two, because they don't actually treat borrowing the way that's treated in this country. I mean, we think of borrowing like credit cards and mortgages, but these countries see it as, well, actually, I'm a shareholder in UK PLC. So when we talk about the furlough scheme, the government's bailing people out. Actually, it's our collective endeavours, our common good going forward over the next 30 years that's helping people right now that are in quite a difficult position. So I guess that's quite a long-winded way to say there's two perspectives to it. One, Scotland should be independent because we should have the very right to make our own choices. But of course, two, there is a sizable amount of the population that in 2014 where, yes, Scotland should be an independent country, but actually for me, not right now. And those people obviously then need more information on specific policies. which is where you can get into a bit of trouble, but also an opportunity, because that's why I think the more independence parties sometimes the better, because, you know, what the SNP say on independence could be different on pro-Labour independence supporters, the Greens, potential list parties, and I think that then makes it easier for people to understand that. So a vote for independence isn't actually a vote for the SNP, as much as it's important that the SNP win elections, because the sheer size and power of the party has actually been the driving force in the campaign over the last several decades.
Yes, of course. No, that's some great points there. Certainly, in the comparison with their experience in Ireland, the 6.5 billion euros that the Irish government raised is in sharp contrast to the 3.5 that the Westminster government say they're going to spend on COVID. So a country the size of Ireland, smaller than Scotland, raising double, or prepared to raise and spend double the amount of money that Westminster is on COVID relief and COVID related projects, I think is very telling. Now, a quick question for you, and I'm going to put this question to everybody, but John asks, and it's as a result of me starting this question, but John, who's in the room, says, can each of you summarise what you mean by social justice? Now, that's a very broad question, so I'm going to ask you to summarise what you mean by social justice in 2 minutes, if that's even possible.
Just any one of us?
I know, Chris, you go first.
Oh, I mean, for me, it's quite simple. It's the common endeavours, the commonwealth of man and woman being spent for the betterment of society. Whereas at the moment, we live in a capitalist system that obviously you just think of anyone at the moment works with an employer. Well, where does the fruit of all that labour go? It often goes to shareholders. It often goes to owners. It often goes to totally disproportionate salaries, with bosses on something like 15 times the lowest paid worker. These are socially unjust situations. And I think that a fairer, more equal Scotland that actually puts social justice at the heart of it, it should be looking at policies such as, well, why do we talk about a minimum wage when the argument should be on a maximum wage? You know, it's obscene that, you know, you've got chief executives and bosses on seven figure salaries in workplaces, telling people how, oh, you know, you need to take a pay cut, you need to go into furlough on 80% of your wages. It's obscene. And I think in a socially just country, of course, you would be absolutely driving a living wage. You would be driving policies that actually, the more money you spend putting into people's pockets, you actually then start achieving all these outcomes that we spend so much money at the moment through crisis intervention. Like, how do we tackle the drugs problem? How do we tackle obesity and diabetes and ill health and poor health inequalities, people's cost of living, life expectancy? I've got a life expectancy 7 years less than somebody 15 miles up the road in Mulgai. You tackle all of these issues fundamentally through a fairer society, and then people that are actually at the top of the tree at the moment actually realise, you know, be lifting people up, everybody's life's a lot better than actually try to keep that unnatural man-made gap in society. And I suppose for me, in 2 minutes, I think on the button, that's what social justice is.
Fantastic, thank you. That was a full 2 minutes, but that was just perfect. Thank you. I think what I'll do is I'll go to Suzanne next, and we'll ask. It's important to get your perspective too, Suzanne. And it's the same question from your perspective. What in your lived experience and from your online campaigning, what do you think social justice means to you and to the people that you deal with?
I think it's equal opportunities. Ultimately, it's, you know, a more evenly spread distribution of wealth, people having more say politically and socially. I mean, really, ultimately, the Scottish government in Scotland is, you know, they speak for Scotland more than the Westminster government, just based on how many seats we have and, you know, the proportion of the vote. In Scotland, we vote for the Scottish government. That is all we vote for. In Westminster, it's a very, very small share compared to what we do in the Scottish government. So, I mean, really, for me, it's social justice is about equal opportunities for everybody.
Of course, no, that's fantastic. Thank you, and is exactly the point. That's great. David, now you started this social justice conversation, and I know you campaign for social justice and on social justice issues across the world. So I'm not going to say 2 minutes, but it would be very interesting in the context, also some of the comments I'm seeing that I'll come to in a minute, but it would be very interesting from your perspective, when you talk about it, what do you mean by social justice?
There's I have some friends in Ireland that are part of a movement called People Before Profit. And I think the term people before profit is actually the same term being used by health workers in Britain at the moment, in England at least. It's saying, well, if they can suddenly find tens of billions of pounds and euros and dollars to say banks and companies, but there was never enough money for healthcare, education, jobs, let alone solving the climate crisis, responding to the problems of, I don't know, women that suffer gender violence, or migrants who are dying in the Mediterranean. And so for me, in brief, social justice would mean turning around all those priorities and saying, if there's a queue where the bankers have to be right at the back and the ordinary people have to be right at the front. But then that raises the question of who is going to do that? And I can't see any Westminster government wanting to do that. But I mean, Chris was talking about Ireland. I mean, my view of Ireland is actually very different. I mean, I was there a year or two ago. There's almost no welfare state. A friend of ours broke her ankle and she said, don't call an ambulance, it costs 600 euros. And so there's a whole series of things. So you have a low tax economy because they don't have any decent welfare state. I know there's now being social advances thanks to mobilization. I mean, the loan that Chris was talking about, I think it's about half of the money that the Irish government went to court not to collect from Apple. So they gave Apple computers a tax break of 14 billion euros, and they went to court in Europe not to have to receive that money. So to then get a loan for some billions of euros, well, great, but they could have had 14 billion euros that was owed to them. And so you have a government, it's exactly what James Connolly said. They became independent formally, but ended up actually for decades, I mean, having a horribly corrupt system, which now, thankfully, now people are starting to change. I mean, in Catalonia, it's a bit better, but even here, the Catalan government for 20 years was under Jordi Pujol, who's now under massive corruption charges. Catalonia is a part of the Spanish state with the highest level of privatization in health and education of any part of the Spanish state. Now, with the COVID crisis, they said that we're going to use private healthcare services. Fine, but they didn't expropriate them. They're paying every single penny for those healthcare services. Actually, the private healthcare, the friends of some of the bosses of Convergència, the Catalan right-wing party, they're now raking money in. And so because of the popular pressure, Convergència, which shifted around to independence, but people can still remember that if there's a shortage of public health care and public education, it's partly because of that party. So I think if we're saying we want social justice, that can't be part of the same sentence as defending the record of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, well, mix them up because they're the same, the two ruling parties in Ireland, or the ruling parties in Catalonia. We have to be clear that we're about something different. Otherwise, people just think this is a trick. I mean, every political force that comes up promises everything. But if you're actually defending the people that produce the current situation, then people see through it very quickly. So I think we do need to break with the current politics. And so I think that does mean it has the class question. It's about who goes first, working people or the rich and the business people. And you can't mix that up. I think you have to take a position on that.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And all that you're saying there is resonating very strongly with a lot of the comments that I'm seeing. For example, on Facebook, we had Heather Meldrum saying the government's only listen to big business, and that is our area of leverage. Identify 2 or 3 of the biggest companies and campaign to ban their products or services. As soon as it begins to hit in the pockets of shareholders, they will be pressurized by the government. Westminster will be pressurized by those companies to cooperate. The corporate world is our leverage, she says, and those points are coming up across. And certainly, people are agreeing with you that. And from my conversations too, there is nothing to distinguish in many ways between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in Ireland, and so that kind of small c, large c conservative approach is absolutely right. I'm going to switch topics a little bit, also using a question that's come in from somebody who's watching us on Facebook Live. And it's a great question. And the question is from Claire Helen Harvey. And she says, don't we need to spend all of our energy to persuade more voters in Scotland of the benefits of independence? And be sure enough that voters are convinced of the benefits of independence to deliver the yes result, and that should be our priority. So there are two questions from Claire. Firstly, don't we need to spend our energy persuading people of the benefits of independence, and how do we do that? I'll go to Suzanne first, because she's not been speaking for a minute. So Suzanne, should we spend all of our energy persuading other voters of the benefits of independence, and how do you think we should do that? I'm not asking you to solve all the world's problems in 30 seconds, but go on.
Ultimately, there's always got to be people that we can't convince. You know, they're so entrenched within unionists that they won't be convinced no matter what we say. However, I do think that, you know, I know that they've wanted to focus on COVID, and absolutely rightly so. But I do think that they could have split their priorities. You know, Nicola's handling COVID and our team around her are handling COVID. They could have had another group constantly campaigning in the background. I think that's the biggest gripe that people have about it, that there's not been a continuation. So it's like the message has just stopped altogether, whereas it could have been continued the whole way along.
Well, I get that. I get that completely. Although I will point out that in terms of the message having stopped, you were standing at a stage in Bannockburn on Wednesday, making sure that the message hadn't stopped. So there are a number of folks who, in their own way, and in appropriate circumstances at this difficult time, who are making very sure that the message hasn't stopped. And Chris made that point that politics hasn't stopped. A lot of the decisions that are being taken at the moment are political, and a number of the people who are commenting from Facebook and in the Zoom and in this call are also making the point that Westminster hasn't stopped politics at all. But Chris, I'll ask you the same question that I put to Suzanne there, and that was, don't we need to spend all of our energy persuading more voters of the benefits of independence as a priority, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I think they're both mutually inclusive. We need to continue to put together a whole range of things. One, there'll be a lot of people in Scotland that look to the Scottish Government and look for them to prove that they can competently govern, so that they can then trust them to take on more responsibilities through the reserved matters. There will be people that think, well, actually, I need more information on what will my pension look like, and of course that takes us back into the social injustice of the situation, that for many people in areas like mine, they die within a year or two of retiring. So when will I get my pension? How much will it be? Currency? These arguments that we already know, people need answers towards that. But ultimately, as we continue to build on the why Scotland should be an independent country, the things we can do differently, we need to be in a position that we can put that to the test. Whereas at the moment, as we see yes going like this and no going like that, quite consistently over a substantial period now, you know, we are ahead in the polls now for the last 3 or 4 of them. But if you look at the trajectory over the last 2.5 years, it's been steady increase, that more and more people are supporting independence, and more people are actually starting to think that, well, actually, no, staying as part of the UK is no longer a viable option. But those polls could be at 60%, or 65%, or 70%, or even 99%. And if you don't have a test, whether that's a referendum or some democratic strategy that has legitimacy, that ultimately you say, this is how we have proven beyond all reasonable doubt the international recognition issue that many people, such as Pete Wishart, who I think someone was alluding to earlier on, that's a good way of introducing that. I think that you've got to be able to test that, because we're not in this for polls. You know, does look great to see these front page headlines that supports 52%, 54%, 56%, but none of that will look as good as just watching the sunrise in an independent Scotland, regardless of what policies our government get up to. So I think that they're certainly both mutually inclusive. Yes, let's keep getting on with the day job, governing well and competently, showing people in Scotland that we're a compassionate, caring government, which is in quite stark contrast, to be quite frank, with what we're seeing with Boris Johnson and his cabal of lunatics. And at the same time, is all under one banner, and other organisations start to crank up the high visibility work, take to the streets again when it's safe to do so, stick to the guidelines, etc. As we go into a new year, I think we will go back into a new campaign, and as we keep those numbers increasing, we need to then put the pressure on so that we can actually test the opinion of the people of Scotland so they can vote for those polls to endorse them.
I think that's absolutely right, and front pages are one thing, and the role of organisations like All Under One Banner. I'll talk about it very, very briefly. The event at Bannockburn that Suzanne spoke at was necessarily at this time a very small event, but I think partly because All Under One Banner is known for generating some fantastic photographs, what I would call the sea of saltires of people walking down the Royal Mile and walking down West George Street, and also in little towns. But because I watched the media on behalf of us, I noticed that a photograph taken at Bannockburn was one of the 10 best photographs in the world in the Brisbane Times on Thursday morning. So that's just about communications and about, you know, that's the thing. But but there needs to. That's just about pictures. It's not the whole thing. But certainly to get an international perspective on this, I'll come to David as well, and so that you can answer this, David, or you can talk about this in respect of Scotland or more generally and in your experience, and in particular because we were talking before, talking about the class-based issues in Catalonia and the aspects of that, and obviously class and those issues at the moment, and perhaps until we can have an independent Scotland, those issues are still in some ways at the core of the independence arguments and the arguments surrounding where as a country and a nation we need to go. The question I was going to ask you as well is, should we be spending all of our time persuading those who are not yet persuaded about independence? And in your experience in Catalonia, how would you go about persuading those who are not yet persuaded of the benefits of independence?
It's a big question, and again, every country is different. I mean, one interesting comparison. I worked for a year with Òmnium Cultural, and Òmnium Cultural is one of the big organizations. The other one is the Catalan National Assembly. And in the run-up to the referendum, Òmnium Cultural was insisting, their main slogan was democracy, the right to vote. And the ANC was saying, vote yes, even when it wasn't even clear we were going to be able to have the referendum. And to me, the Òmnium position was much more convincing, because it's saying it's about people's right to decide about their lives. And that's something that can link up with people, whether they're having problems about housing or whatever problems they're having, they can link up to that sort of democratic view about the right to decide on your life. Whereas the argument just saying vote yes, first took for granted we're going to have a referendum, won't have to fight for it. And secondly, I think it only appealed to the people who already agreed with it. So a campaign that just appeals to the people who already agree with you is actually going nowhere. So the people already felt in their hearts that they wanted Catalonia to be independent. Well, of course, they're going to vote yes. The question was, how do you win over the people who didn't have that in their heart? I'm pro-independence, but I'm not an independentist. I mean, it's not part of my DNA. It's something that I support because I think it can bring progress. And so there's, I think, hundreds of thousands of people there who we can win over, sorry to be boring about this, but on the social questions, that people who have it as a national feeling in their heart, well, I respect that, but, you know, that's something you have it or you don't have it. You know, you like the Beatles, you like the Rolling Stones, you can't argue about it. The question is to win a political battle and to get to that 60, 70, 80% that Chris was talking about. We won't do it just on the basis of the people who have this deep feeling in their heart that they have, you know, this pride when they see this or that flag. And I think here the idea of first independence, then we'll talk about what we're going to do, I think doesn't work. I mean, in Spain, there was a tragic experience, the fight against Franco in 1936. The dominant view was first we fight Franco, and then we can talk about social justice. And in order to put off the battle for social justice, actually meant repressing workers and peasants who wanted to take over the land, who wanted to take over their own lives. So there's actually, you know, important lessons on that. So I think to win people to independence, we can't just say, well, we'll see afterwards if it's going to be a neoliberal nightmare with housing crisis like in Ireland, or if it be a country with social justice. You can't just say, we'll leave that aside. You know, if people are going to fight for this, and like people have literally had to put their life, you know, their bodies on the line in Catalonia, they have to know what they're fighting for. Secondly, on a much more positive note, there's a question in the chat here about building international solidarity. One of the things I was doing in late 2017 was trying to build an international solidarity movement, something called With Catalonia. And we had interesting events in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it was something that was actually the main movements hadn't thought about. How do you build solidarity with ordinary people around Europe? Because a lot of the independence movement, you know, was building internationalism, but it was like called inter-nationalism. So you had the Catalan nationalist movement talking to Sinn Féin, talking to Scottish movements, talking to the Kurds, talking to the Palestinians, but they weren't talking to ordinary Spanish people, ordinary German people, ordinary French people. And that's the base of ordinary working people across Europe, and more widely is where we need to win that support. And it's possible. I mean, when the Spanish government sent in police to Catalan government offices on the 20th of September, that's, if you've seen the photos of Jordi Cuixart and Jordi Sanchez on top of a police car trying to call on people to be calm and go home. Yep. They're now in prison for that. There were solidarity protests in about 30 or 40 Spanish cities, including Burgos, that was Franco's capital. And so on the basis of the mobilization and the demonstrations you're having as under one banner, that's really important in terms of making this visible and people feeling that, yes, I support that. And after the 1st of October repression, there were massive mobilizations across Spain. The problem was that the independence movement wasn't really focused on that. Either they were focused on just looking inside Catalonia because we're not Spain, so why talk to the Spaniards? Mistake. You can't negotiate with the Spanish government, but you can build links with Spanish workers. And even when they did try and build international links, it was at the level of getting VIPs to sign things and appear in videos, which is fine, it helps. But With Catalonia was an attempt to build horizontal links through the networks where he had the anti-war movement, the anti-racist movement, the unions and so on, and getting people mobilizing rallies. We had people in Warsaw in Poland organizing rallies in solidarity with Catalan right to decide. And in Scotland, of course, there was there, and the whole protest with Clara Ponsati. But we had people in France organizing public meetings about Catalan's right to decide. And France doesn't have a good record on national questions. So it's that sort of horizontal basis. The VIPs are fine. The official negotiations are fine, and getting people to the European Parliament. But I think what's really important is, and it comes back to the class question, ordinary working class people in Britain, in England, in France, in Germany, can understand the idea that people want to control their own lives. Whether you feel massively Scottish or Catalan inside, well, that won't really move them. But the idea that it's about democracy, I think that can win battles. And I think that's the way to go.
That's great. Thank you, David. There are a number of really important points in there. And the idea of horizontal relationships certainly strikes me from this perspective of the independence movement here with organizations like Farmers for Yes, Pensioners for Yes, Lawyers for Yes, those horizontal relationships that may or may not be class related, I think are an important part of bringing a matrix together. Now, there are three things I'm going to say very quickly. Firstly, I can see that Bob Fotheringham has got his hand up in the Zoom call. So Bob, not yet, but I'm going to come to you for your question in 10 seconds. The second point I was going to make is that I can see a lot of people talking on Facebook and in Zoom asking about sources of information with regard to the economic answers and some of the social justice answers. And I will certainly suggest that people go and look at either Business for Scotland, their website, and their book Believe in Scotland, and also the new Believe in Scotland campaign that is connected to Business for Scotland. They are doing a great deal online and in print to provide answers that will, or some answers to some of the questions that people have. And I know that other organisations are looking actively at publishing and disseminating economic and social justice answers and proposals at the moment as well. So please have a look at that. And of course, the point is also being made that in 2014, in contrast to the referendum in 2017, in 2014, the Scottish Government published a 600-page white paper that sought to begin to answer all manner of questions, and certainly from my own perspective, that white paper is probably still valid in many ways, but that's just my perspective. However, having said all of that, if we can find Bob on here, and we'll go to him. Bob, can you hear me, Bob?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, and we can see you too. Bob, what's your question?
Right, I've actually got a couple of questions, two or three questions. We'll try and be quite quick.
All right, stick to one or two.
Right, okay. Yeah, on the social justice question, I ask the panel, I mean, I'm not as convinced as some people seem to be about how well the SNP government have done during this crisis. And one of the big problems we've had is in care homes, for example. Would it not be a good idea in terms of social justice to point to a different future in terms of renationalising care homes in Scotland and making them, you know, part of a public service in Scotland? So that would be one thing, you know, using that sort of mechanism that the Scottish government could use to actually point to a different way forward for Scotland. Second question, I mean, I thought the way Chris outlined the problem of getting in a Section 30 order with regards to the Tory government, I think was quite useful. But one of the problems I think we've got is that I don't see that the current leadership of the independence movement, i.e. the SNP, are going to force a plan B in opposition to the British government. So how can the grassroots of the movement actually achieve that? And also beyond that, I think we'll need alliances. What sort of alliances are we going to need to actually force the British state into accepting the fact that Scotland's got the right to determine its own future and have an independence referendum? Because I don't see them automatically acceding to that, in my view. That's it.
Great, Bob. Thank you. That's fantastic. And those are a number of great questions. What I'll do is I'll split those questions up if I can. What I'll do, the question about care homes, which is an important part of social justice, I'll ask that question to Suzanne and to Chris. But I think the question about what alliances do we need, and I'll evolve that to talk about international alliances. I'll take that question to David, because he's the expert on international campaigning and international alliances, who we have the benefit of having in the room tonight. But first of all, your point with regard to care homes and the learning that we have from the current COVID crisis and the pressure, the discussion that there has already been, but which is probably growing round about the provision of a national care service and potentially the change of the model that's in place in Scotland for providing social care. Chris, I'll ask you that question. First. What's your perspective on using a change in the social care structure to demonstrate the benefits of independence?
Yeah, I mean, the care home situation there's no other way to describe it other than a tragedy, but a lot of it still doesn't make sense, because Inverclyde, with the highest mortality rate in Scotland, you would assume then the care homes, but we've seen a lot of deaths. Of course, we've seen tragic situations in care homes, but for some reason we're actually one of the lower ends of the mortality rate for deaths in care homes. So sometimes you've got to just say at the moment it doesn't, to me, make sense. Something's clearly did go wrong. It's really easy for opposition parties, with the benefit of hindsight, to say that you should have done 2 tests before anyone was moved from a hospital into a care home, and I agree with that. But you know, they didn't make that point at the time when they could have in Parliament, when health boards and councils were buying up beds so that we could tackle delayed discharge, which is the technical term for when you delay the discharge from hospital because people that shouldn't be in hospital are still in hospital. And I think there was a reasonable fear that people who were healthy in a hospital environment could end up catching coronavirus in the hospital, and also that the beds would be needed. And I think that for many years this subject will be studied, that this is like a generational issue, the pandemic. And I think one of the real lessons that we'll learn is that we perhaps put too much emphasis on protecting the NHS, which maybe doesn't sound right, but perhaps we should have put more emphasis on protecting people to stop them needing the NHS. And I think that's maybe my fair reflection on it at the moment. But again, if you look across the world, many, if not all, of your sort of what you class as Western governments took the same decisions. They wanted to try and get vulnerable people out of hospitals, get them back into a care home setting so that they could free up capacity. I mean, the same people that are criticising, and I think it's absolutely fine and fair and legitimate, particularly if you've had loss, and I've had my fair experience in my community. It's perfectly legitimate to be angry and to be demanding answers. But I remember when the Chinese were building a super hospital and everybody was amused at how amazing that was. I remember when the Nightingale Hospital was getting built in London and the Lisa Jordan was getting built in Glasgow, and everybody was clapping and they thought this was brilliant. Look at this warlike effort that we can mobilise. At that point, nobody was saying, actually, this is a bad idea. We don't want to be creating more capacity in the hospital. We want to be stopping the virus, suppressing it, and stopping people coming in. And coincidentally, Angus MacNeil, because we were talking about my plan, him and I were very vocal on test, trace and isolate. We were listening to a lot of what Dr. Harry Burns was saying, the former Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, and we got into that position. Again, I just thought, to come into a background that you've been dealing with, I mean, we're into the three figures. To put it quite starkly, it's been the single biggest cause of death in Inverclyde since the Green Blitz. So it's quite a monumental thing that I think it's fair to reflect on before going on to the political point. And the political point is the current care system fit for purpose? The simple answer is no. It's a system that we have allowed private companies with nice cuddly names to open up care homes, and we thought this is great. It's such a noble pursuit of private business. They seem reasonable, but when you look into it, the resource into the care system isn't adequate enough to both let the provider make a reasonable profit and pay the staff a reasonable wage. So what we see is that the staff, who are the same people that Priti Patel was telling us actually weren't skilled workers enough and we didn't need these people coming to the country, these are the people that we stood clapping, those that took part in that, because I know that it did start to get a bit political, like wearing a poppy towards the end if you weren't doing it, which again, that's neither here nor there because that's a different debate. But this has made it clear that too many people get paid poverty wages, but they carry out the most critical functions in society. People that work in public sanitation, people that clean streets, you know what I mean? Because all of a sudden we've realised that we need to clean surfaces in schools and in hospitals and in areas if we don't want viruses to be spread, but these people are on minimum wage, and in care settings, too many people are on low wages. And I think that the solution going forward, because I know that the easy solution is to say let's have a national care service like the NHS, build it from scratch. But I think regardless of who is ownership, whether it's councils, private, public venture, whatever, I think the quantum is what's key, because you know all these care homes all look different, they're all different sizes, they've all got different services. I think we need to actually establish what's the best quantum for delivering care. And if that does involve support for the private sector, I was once upon a time very ideologically opposed to that, but now I'm kind of more of the sort. It's about outcomes, and of the best outcomes. So what are the best outcomes? Good quality of care, healthy, longer lives for people in care. How do we achieve that? Whereas probably for too long, people live in care homes, perhaps they've not got many families still living, perhaps they've not got many family that visit them. For too often care homes that are behind big gated, big walled, big hedged properties. What happens in a care home happens in a care home. And I think that this pandemic has crystallised that actually that's not really a dignified and socially just way going forward. And that's going to need sizable, adequate resource going forward. And that is something that then, I suppose if I class myself as quite lucky because I'm a tradesman, etc., we're going to need to have tough decisions whether we consider a more progressive taxation system or whether some of the services that we spend money on at the moment, actually, I'd rather that money be spent on making sure that people in care homes get access to good quality care. And actually the people that are the nurses and the carers in those care homes aren't getting paid £8 an hour. Because I think this crisis has certainly taught me that as an electrician, these people should be getting paid a lot more than me. And I certainly, as an electrician, can make more than £8 an hour. So, and I think it's quite actually grotesque when I reflect on that, what I earn for effectively putting sockets on walls. And you've got people that are in charge of your grandfather, your mother, your your auntie, your uncle in a care home, and it's just not good enough what we pay them. So whether that's a national care system, whether that's the NHS takes control or councils, I think we need to make sure the people that are actually trusted to care actually get treated with a lot more dignity going forward.
Thanks, Chris. I think there's a number of good points there. It certainly across 2 points that you were making there. Certainly struck me. I think there is an inevitably, because it's people's relatives that we're talking about. There is an emotional component. I certainly remember as the crisis took off, I got the phone call from the care home that my father's in, and they were phoning around telling the families of the residents that 25% of the residents in that care home had died in a month. And that's not a conversation that I really wanted to hear. And so there was an emotional component. And similarly, the emotions related to the Blitz in Port Glasgow. My grandfather was an air raid warden from time to time, and he was in Clydebank during the Blitz, and he never spoke about the events that he saw, never. So there is an emotional component there, and so it's an interesting thing to reflect in, without getting too heavy, the kind of technocratic politics that we have nowadays, and of course the argument in the independence campaign, if it's about setting the Heather on fire, or if it's about if it's about Braveheart, or if it's about technocratic answers. There's that. It's interesting to see the balance coming in, but I'll stop talking. I'm not meant to be talking. Suzanne, the conversation here was about care homes, whether as a demonstration of social justice in an independent Scotland, there ought to be changes in the care sector. Have you seen, or either from your own experience, or have you seen in your work online, any comments or any views around that kind of area?
Well, I worked in the social care sector for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this has always been an area that's close to my heart. And honestly, throughout this whole COVID crisis, I feel that social care staff have just been forgotten when it comes down to PPE supplies, you know, how much they're valued. I mean, I'm not saying that the NHS workers don't deserve the praise, but don't forget about the people that are going. They've been putting themselves at more risk. These staff, these social care workers who are going in and out of different people's homes, you know, they could be going into 20 homes a day. They're the ones that are actually really putting themselves at risk. And I really feel that they've been undervalued throughout this whole crisis. The biggest problem with care homes is that there's far too many that are privatised, and it's just people lining their pockets at the expense of the elderly. The staff are undervalued. They're treated appallingly. You know, I've heard stories from people just in this area who have been expected to go to work and not been provided with gloves or an apron or anything, and it's just not acceptable at all, because ultimately staff in the hospitals were being allowed to refuse to treat people for this reason, but in care homes they were told they had to do it whether they liked it or not, or they'd lose their job. For me, social care should be nationalised. That's the top and bottom of it. Just now, I know that local councils, they struggle with private companies, whether it's care homes or, you know, social care workers in the community. They struggle with providers. These providers are allowed to call the shots because there's not enough resources for the demand, and they're calling the shots to the council rather than the other way around. They're not being regulated properly or anything. And I could talk all day about this, but social care should be privatised ultimately.
Nationalised, you mean?
Nationalised, sorry.
I get you. No, the point you're making is absolutely clear. That's fantastic. Thank you. Your lived experience and also what you're seeing in your communities and your online activism, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Thank you. Now then, there was the second of Bob's questions was something I was going to talk to David about. And Bob's second question was about what alliances do you think that we need to build in support of to help us win our independence? Now, obviously, in 2014, the position of countries like Spain was said to be that they would be negative. They would be negative. It was told to us by the press that Spain would respond negatively, and it's well recognised that the unionist campaigners in 2014 2013 sought alliances and contributions from everybody from Barack Obama to Vladimir Putin across the world, and everybody in between. But the world has moved on since then. I think it's very clear from the EU, the mood music, and some statements as well saying alliance between Scotland and the European Union or European institutions, let me put it that way, is not expected to be a significant problem. However, from your experience and perspective from working around the world, what sort of alliances do you think we need to be building and focusing on to help build support for independence in Scotland?
I would say don't trust any government, any state. I mean, the experience of Catalonia, for example, the Baltic states that became independent thanks to mobilizations and also thanks to all the upsurges in the USSR. Those countries that you'd have thought would have supported Catalonia in the end didn't do anything because they're all tied into the system of the European Union. They have their debts, both financial debts and political debts, and so you just can't trust them. If somebody comes up, fine, okay, great. There'll always be individual politicians that make speeches, which all helps, but I just say don't trust any states or any governments. What I mentioned earlier about trying to build solidarity from below, we had a movement called With Catalonia. Mm-hmm. Actually, the name was thought up by an Irish activist who was here the 10th of October when we had the sort of interrupted Republican declaration. And we had like a congress of hundreds of people in December to build solidarity from the social movements from the left to build solidarity with Catalonia. We had people from Catalonia, we had people from around the Spanish state, we had people from around Europe, from Ireland, from Scotland, from Germany, from Greece, and I don't know, well, even from Quebec. And it was a good experience. It was the beginning of the With Catalonia campaign that we had groups in different parts of the world. It was still too much dependent on, like from the Spanish state, we had, I think, 150 people, which is good. But a lot of them from the Basque Country and from Galicia and from Andalusia, from a sort of Andalus nationalist movement. There weren't enough from mainstream Spain, but there were people there from across Spain. There were people, there was somebody from Corsica, but there was also people from Paris. So it was a good step in the right direction. And we had a series of mobilizations, of public meetings and so on. And so that network can be built. I mean, one sort of a piece of a possibility or a direction to be thinking in is if the SNP and the Scottish government are talking to other governments, fine, they should do that, other parties. But from the movements and from places possibly like all under one banner, you could be maybe thinking about how to link up with people on the left, not just in Brittany and Catalonia and Corsica, but also in mainstream populations of those countries, in Paris, in Berlin, in Madrid as well, trying to make those contacts and having meetings. Without the virus, you could say maybe have a public meeting. On the other hand, maybe given the situation of the virus and everyone's online, it's actually easier to get a speaker into Paris now through Zoom than it is to fly somebody over. So you can do all sorts of things. And at the beginning, it might be very modest, but just trying to get out of the mindset of we're a nationalist movement, we need to talk to other nationalist movements. So you have to think we're an internationalist movement, we need to talk to other internationalist people from whatever country and whatever language they speak. And there's enough people in Scotland that speak Spanish and French and German and Greek, and also so you could have those contacts with parties, with movements and so on, and to build that sort of low-level networking. But I think right now, it also depends on what happens in Scotland, because when we had the high level of struggle in Catalonia, there was lots of mobilizations around the world. I mean, not talking about millions of people, but we had significant, I mean, in Athens, I had several demonstrations of over 1,000 people, maybe 2,000 people, which is not bad at all. But then the year later, I was on holiday in Dublin, and I said to a comrade there, you know, couldn't you do something? He said, look, you know, we have Palestine, we have this, we have that. And now if you look at the international agenda, you know, you've got Belarus, you've got Lebanon, you've got so many millions of things. So in Scotland, you're talking about, you have another referendum, you do this or that. You know, it's interesting and people would like to know about that, but that's not going to get people on the street. So the mobilizations you do in Scotland, as and when you can do them, can inspire people across in other countries if you built those links. If those mobilizations are not simply, I prefer this flag to that flag, but have that social justice content, then that is a lot easier for people to identify with in Berlin and in other, in Paris and in London as well. I mean, a priority would be to talk to ordinary working people in Britain, in England, because they're not happy with Boris Johnson, easy mistake to make. They're not happy with Boris Johnson. They've got all sorts of reasons to complain about it. So if you can link your complaints in Scotland, say we have the same problem of healthcare and everything, but we also have the fact that we're another country that is not treated well by a London government, and so we want the right to decide for ourselves. And people can link to that, I think. I mean, the experience in Catalonia is when you were able to put the arguments, you could make headway. One of the problems, we had the massive movements, and most of that massive movement just didn't take this into account at all. They just had too much a nationalist agenda. And I think paradoxically, the best way to win national liberation is by being internationalist, sometimes not being nationalist. And I think those are some of the lessons we've learned in Catalonia. I mean, there's there's a remains of that network. And I'm sure those people that mobilized for Catalonia will be pleased to mobilize for Scotland. But that's as and when you move, then we can call on those people. But even before then, you can start making those links and say, look, we have this coming up. Can we talk to you? And, I have a list of contacts. So those contacts can be your contacts if you need them.
Thank you. That's fantastic. That's a very useful perspective. I think the internationalist aspect, you touched on 1936 before, and if nothing, and the campaign in 1936 was nothing if not international. And the nature, it's something that I talk about from time to time in the context of Brexit mainly, but the international aspect of the Scottish experience, either through the clearances or through the diaspora, or by the enthusiasm with which Scots spread throughout the world during the British Empire and at other times, but in particular in a European context, our ancient history of trading satisfactorily and peacefully across Europe going back hundreds of years at a time when other parts of the British Isles were not doing so. We've been trading with Sweden and France and with all sorts of other nations.
Sorry, can I just be very rude and interrupt with one last quote from Jody Couchard from this interview from a few weeks ago?
Yes.
It's very relevant. We must spare no effort in explaining ourselves every day more and better and without slacking. The attacks on democracy in Catalonia also affect people in the north of Spain, in the neighborhoods of Madrid, or in poorer rural areas in the south. Because what it's about, what really annoys the powers of the state, is the simple idea that citizens can question the current status quo and put their privileges into question. So I think that's a sort of vision. That's Jordi Cuixart, who's the leader of the biggest organization in Catalonia. I think that's a sort of direction that's interesting to look at. Sorry about the interruption.
No, you're absolutely not. That was a fantastic point that you're making, and it's exactly the point. And if from the conversation that we've been having from this evening, for everybody who's watching, both in Zoom and on Facebook and on other platforms, if the takeaway from this evening is that we must explain every day and without slacking, and that the thing that governments hate most is citizen power and citizen activism, then that's going to be a very powerful message for everybody to be thinking of from this evening. I'm noticing that it's now 10 o'clock in Scotland and it's 11 o'clock with you. So I think we've had a fantastic 90-minute conversation here. Chris and Suzanne and you, David, have spoken eloquently and with information and with passion and with experience. And it has been speaking personally, but I can also see from the comments that I'm watching from across the platforms, everybody's extremely grateful to all three of you, and everyone's saying that the conversation and the debate this evening has been fantastic. Now, it would not have been possible without you, and I'm very grateful to each of you for giving up your Friday evenings and for contributing to this conversation and joining in the latest of these panels that we've been hosting. What I was going to say very quickly was that on Saturday, the 12th of September, there would have been an all under one banner march in Stirling. We were working extremely hard on the arrangements and we were expecting it to be another fantastic event. Instead, for now, there will be an online ceòl on Broadcasting Scotland that evening. We're hoping to have many performers who are local to Stirlingshire taking part, and maybe one or two small surprises as well. So search for Broadcasting Scotland on YouTube and enjoy the show on the evening of Saturday, the 12th of September. All Under One Banner is going to host more online talks and discussions here on Zoom through August and beyond. Coming up next Friday is a historical discussion on the borders of Scotland with the stand-up and speaker Bruce Fumey. After that, there will be a legal panel discussion with Mike Daly, Michael Gray and Caroline Welsh. And we're planning further events, one with Paul Kavanagh, Wee Ginger Doug, and with the trades union movement in Scotland. So please look out for those events on All Under One Banner's social media. We're also planning more events. So if you have any suggestions or any contributions, please message our Facebook page and let us know. There will also be demonstrations in the months ahead, each extremely carefully organised and appropriate for the circumstances that we will find ourselves in at that time. As matters are currently planned, we expect to be in George Square in Glasgow on Thursday, the 17th of September. So please watch All Under One Banner's social media for details. We've already started publicising and talking about that event. All Under One Banner is persevering through the current adversity, and I know that everyone else is doing their best as well. We're not going away, and we will continue to campaign for independence. You will see announcements in the press and online, and you can be sure that we're working away behind the scenes on plans for a number of things for the months to come. But in the meantime, thank you again to Suzanne, to David, and to Chris. Thanks also to Brian, Aaron, and Kevin, who are working behind the scenes. And thank you, of course, to every single one of you for joining us here tonight, and especially to those of you who contributed or to ask such great questions. If I can ask Chris and David and Suzanne to stay in the call, but apart from that, otherwise we'll end this evening's discussion. We've been All Under One Banner. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
Good night.
Hello, my name's Steve B, and I'm a presenter on IndyLive Radio. I present music and musings every Friday night at 7. The music, that's 70s classic rock, although we will take the occasional side road. The musings, well, they're thoughts on Scottish independence, politics and world events from my viewpoint, which is that of a grumpy old man. So join me every Friday night at 7 on IndyLive Radio, a new voice for a new Scotland.
Hi, I'm Fiona from Clackmannanshire Women for Independence. Did you know we have a podcast on IndyLive Radio? Goes out at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, repeated at 6 o'clock on a Thursday. Come and join us for some news, views, opinions, the odd poem. Be very nice to have you with us. And come and hear the news you're not getting. Here's some new voices for a new Scotland at IndyLive Radio.
Film, you can watch this again, you can be part of it. It's Independence Live. Yeah, a few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
No Westminster. No Westminster, come on. No Westminster, not for me, not for me. But before I'll be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home. to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom, come on. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. One more. Oh, freedom over me. But before I be your slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Hi there, I'm Cliff.
And I'm Russ.
And we're from the Veterans for Scottish Independence 2.0 group. And we're just invading your privacy today to let you know that we will be very shortly pushing a programme out on live stream to do with the veterans, their needs as it will be during an independent campaign. The next independence campaign, and indeed in an independent Scotland.
So get yourself in gear, come and join us, pull up a sandbag.
Yes.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.